Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. First, thanks for coming and visiting. I appreciate it. If you'd hit the like button before you leave, that helps me out a lot. And I'd love to have you subscribe to my channel. A special shout out to my patrons over at Patreon. I really appreciate your support. Your contribution is part of what makes this possible, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. If you're interested in Patreon or supporting me in another way by buying me a coffee, there's links to both of those in my video description down below, as well as at the top of my YouTube channel page. So check those out. Here's a few projects that I've done for the Patreon recently, so you might want to take a peek at those. So thank you to those of you who've been commenting and making suggestions. I appreciate those kinds of things, so continue to do so. I take those into consideration. So I thought today I'm in the mood to make some big kind of showy pendant, and I have some pretty lapis, and I thought maybe I'd do a couple of things I haven't done before. I'm mounting I have a cylindrical, or kind of a sort of a pointy cone shaped piece of lapis that I'm going to hang from the main stone with a hinge, and I don't think I've made a bezel cap for something like that yet in any of my videos, so that's something new. I'm also going to mount a stone on a bale, and I'm pretty sure I haven't done that for any of my previous videos, but that's what we'll be doing, making a pretty lapis pendant. Let's get going. Okay, let's start out by showing you some stones here. Two main stones. This is a lapis. I have this kind of shield shaped piece that I've always wanted to make something out of. And recently we picked up these kind of cylindrical, but they come to a point. I'm not sure what you'd call that, a cone, I guess. And so we're going to make a bezel for this one, make a bezel cap for this one. I'll hinge them together, and I'm going to create a bail up here, and then I'm going to mount one of these two. I still am not sure which one I want to do. Now, I've been leaning towards the tanzanite, but my wife likes this iolite, so I'm still trying to decide. I think this time I'll go with my wife's advice and do the iolite. We'll see. I think it'll look good. Okay, so I'm going to put him over here so I don't lose him. And I think let's start with, after we go over materials, we'll start with the main bezel here. So yeah, here's the materials. I'm going to use 3/16 inch 28 gauge fine silver bezel strip for the bezel. I'll be using for the back of the bezel a 26 gauge sterling sheet. This border around here is going to be 14 gauge square wire. Let's see. I'm going to have some 22 gauge sheet I think I'm going to use for the bail up top. I don't know what I'm going to use for the little square thing. Maybe just some more 14 gauge for the little, I'm at a loss for words as to what to call that. Normally I put a jump ring there, but I'm going to do a little kind of angular one for this one. Bail connection piece. How about that? As always, I use hard silver solder and a flux called My-T-Flux, and I get that from Rio Grande. The last thing that I need is some tubing for the hinge here, and I'm going to be using, I'm not sure how I got sent this. This is actually fine silver, but it'll work just fine. It's 2.34 millimeter outside diameter, 0.3 millimeter wall, and it's just the right size for a piece of 14 gauge round to fit in as a pin. So we use that for our hinge, and then I found a little scrap piece of 14 gauge round. So I think that's everything. Alright, so let's start making a bezel for this guy. Alright, so let's grab the bezel. Interestingly, lapis is not a mineral, it's a combination of minerals, so it's technically a stone rather than a mineral. I know it's got sodalite as one of its components, and pyrite oftentimes you'll find in it. There's something else, I don't remember what the other mineral is. As always, when you're doing something with a point, don't end the bezel at the point. That's a bad idea. I always make them into an angular shape, which oftentimes baffles people a little bit, but I find it makes it easier to solder the two ends together. Another thing you can do with bigger bezels, if you put a little dimple in the bottom like that, it makes the overall thing springier, and so you get that desirable tension between the two sides, so they're pushing together tightly. Do some reshaping. That's a pretty good guess on my part as far as where the corners should go. So we got the size pretty good on this one. When I have a sharp corner like that, I usually want to make sure that the size is really good. There's some things sometimes with stones that come to a point like this. Oftentimes the tip drops down significantly more than over here. So when you're setting it, sometimes you need to file the bezel down just a little bit. You know, a gradual taper down so it's narrower down here than it is up here. But this one looks pretty even actually. I don't have to do that much probably on this one. So that's good. All right, a couple of ways you could do the back thing here. Could use some thick sheet and let it stick out like that. I'm getting a little low on my thickest sheet, which is 18. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll solder a piece of 14 gauge square around it after I just put a bottom on the bezel, and that works just as well, and it looks neat as well. So as long as you get a good solder seam all the way around it. One of the reasons that I want to do this is this stone comes to a point, and if I'm going to have a hinge attached to this end here, I need to have a little bit of flat surface there in order to build a hinge on, and in order to do that, I'm going to have something sticking out here that I can file a flat spot into, if that makes sense. So that's part of the reason that that's there. I also just like the way it looks. Okay, so let's do a back there. If you haven't watched one of my videos before, I usually leave a little excess sheet sticking out here that I'm going to trim off. The reason I do that is because the bezel sitting on top of it kind of protects the sheet from the heat or providing from above, and the bezel itself is vulnerable to direct heat. The sheet itself, being flat on the pad, is harder to get up to the temperature it needs for the solder to stick to it. And so sometimes people melt their bezel before they ever get the sheet up to temperature, and this gives you a place to point the heat at other than just the center there in order to pump the heat into that bottom sheet so it gets hot enough. So I'd rather use plenty of solder than not enough solder. And when we're doing something like this, it's always easiest to do it on the inside, from my opinion, because the inside is going to be covered by a stone, and so if there's any mess left over, it doesn't matter. Sometimes when you're soldering stuff down, you're going to leave some of that sheet that's sticking out, on the outside and having a big messy solder mess out there. Big messy mess. That's a little redundant, isn't it? You know, puddled excess solder or whatever is going to be, you have to clean that up somehow. This way we don't care. A seam all the way around, I think. I'll inspect it before we trim it off. Okay, that's pretty good. Sometimes it's tricky getting a tight border around something that's not circular or oval. So I'm going to spend some time making sure the shape is really good before I cut it down to size. I'm going to try and see if I can't bend it around these ones, but I'm definitely going to have a split down here on this. So let's see what we can do here. I'll cut myself a piece that's not quite as big. Okay. Let's see if make sure I got enough over here and enough over here. I think I'm going to start at the top. Try to get a curve going. That's pretty good. Just trying to mark kind of where the corner starts. Whenever you're bending square wire, if you've never done this before, square wire, because of its geometry, will have a tendency to try and twist on you when you bend it sharply, because it's trying to find the easiest way to bend. And the way I'm trying to bend it is going against the way it really wants to bend. If you need to migrate a bend, if you take it off center like that so you're not sitting on a flat spot and squeeze, it'll move that bend a little bit for you. Now see, this curve on the top doesn't bend far enough yet, so I'm going to work on that a little bit. You can see I'm getting pretty close to being tied up against the top there, so now I just have to work on these guys. I can cut these off a little bit shorter now, probably. I'm marking where it separates away from the bezel, so I know where to start the bend. Starting to get there, right? That's pretty good. So now you could do this in a couple of ways. Let's see if you can see that here. You could cut it right along here, or you could cut them both off straight down the middle like this at an angle that'll make them straight. I think probably I'm going to do the former. So I'll cut it off right there. Solder that to that one, and then I'll trim off the excess. So we'll see how that goes. That's where that needs to be soldered on right there. So I'm going to make sure that that's lined up in that spot, solder it together, and then I'll flatten it out better, and then we'll force it around this, solder it on. So that should be snug enough, hopefully. I'm going to change the angle slightly here. Okay, see. You can see how I use those little marks to kind of decide where to put that in there. It helps me to keep it sort of where I want it to be. I keep saying I'm going to clean that, and then I keep not cleaning it. Pick up a little bit of solder over here. You could, if you wanted to, just lay a piece over there. I'm just kind of a pick soldery guy. Let's make sure everything's nice and flat. I just usually do that to make sure it's pretty flat on one side. All right. So we want it to be pretty tight so that when we solder this, there's not going to be a big seam there that you can see. Got that on there now. I'm going to be doing my first live stream over on Patreon this weekend. I'm excited to see how that goes. Okay, I'm just going to make sure everything's all flat there. Probably flux it a little bit, and then I'll solder it up over here. What I'll do is I'll flux this, and I'm going to set it on top of these pieces of solder, and then heat from the top. It should draw it right up in there. So I'm adding some more because I can see that it didn't really flow along that side as well. Throw that on there. And draw a little bit more solder up in there. Okay, I think I do. Looks all right to me. I always inspect the solder joint to see if there's any, big gaps or anything. Is there a gap? I think there's actually a little hole right there. It's strange that it happens so symmetrically in the middle of that. So I'm going to add just a little bit of solder there. So in order to create that flat spot down here, I need to file this tip off. And rather than spend a long time filing, I'm going to snip part of it off and then I'll file the rest. I think I'm just going to go ahead and throw him in the pickle for now, and we'll start working on the little bezel cap for this guy. I'm still going to use the same kind of bezel. The one thing about this that's going to be different is I'm going to be wrapping the top of this like that and then just putting a piece of 26 on the top. But generally stuff like this isn't really, you can't securely set it without some sort of adhesive. And so I'll be using some 5-minute epoxy to epoxy that in towards the end of the project here. There's just not an easy way to do it without, you know, where this something that hangs like this is secure. So we'll give that a go and see how it goes. I don't want to have a huge amount of excess space on this one, so I'm going to make sure he's pretty tight. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now let's put a little piece of 26 gauge on the top. So I just need to trim this off a bit now. And we need to start thinking about my bail here. So it's got to be wide enough to hold this stone on it, along with the bezel. And this is 22 gauge. And I want to make this a real rectangular on the top. So it's going to end up being a shape like when I cut it out, it'll have a flat part on the top here. So I'll bend it sharply here and bring these two bottom ends together, and they'll go through a slot. I'll go right down through there. So I'm looking at the top view here. And then we'll mount that bezel on the front. That's not exact, but that's okay. I think next what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and make the bezel for the little tiny stone here, and solder it on here where I want it to go, and then I'm going to drill a hole right through the bail so that the tip of the stone has a little place to sit. Every time I spray this bottle, it sprays to the side. So I think I want this somewhere up near the top. Maybe about right there. Dremel and punch a hole through that, right in the center of that bezel. So I'll be right back. Alright, so I drilled a little hole through there, and I think, let's try and bend this now. I clearly don't want this to sit up that high, so I'm going to shorten this significantly. Okay, I need to add a little square wire rectangle up there for this to sit attached to that. See, I just need to round those out a little bit so they match the curve there, and then I can solder it on. As always, when you're soldering something big to something small, most of the heat needs to go into the bigger piece, just because it takes longer to get that up to the right temperature. Oops, I moved that thing. That looks reasonably straight. Guess we'll find out. That looks like an arrowhead. Strangely, I've been a rock hound for my entire adult life, pretty much. But I've yet to find an arrowhead. I've never found an arrowhead. Strangely. Okay. So now, these things have a tendency, no matter what shape you're making them, when you push them together, they want to bounce back. And so what I did to push that together, as you can see, made a slight angle in the middle of the sheet there in order to bend it towards it. So normally if it's straight like that. So I'll solder it and then I can straighten it out afterwards. It needs to be able to migrate around like that, so I just needed to make sure there was room for that. And so what I did was I thinned this out a little bit in both dimensions. So I'm going to position it up like that so I can just reach it with a pick there. So the reason I'm doing the bail right now, I usually do the bail last, but since I'm going to be doing some hinges, and it's one of the few times I use a different type of solder when I'm putting the pin in, I'll be using some easy solder at the end, and I wanted to make sure that I had everything that I wanted to do with hard solder done beforehand. It's important for the way it hangs for us to get this bottom line parallel with the top of the thing. So I don't have a huge amount of room to work with here. So think I'm going to put the single one up here, and I think I'll put the two that go to either side of it down here. And in order to do that, I need to cut some little pieces of tube here. I usually just use the jeweler's saw to cut myself a couple of pieces here. And I started going backwards against the teeth just to get it started. If you try and cut this stuff with wire cutters, it'll of course crimp. But before you get to the other side, just want to break it off. So it doesn't go shooting off across the room when you finally do get through it. Cut this one to be used over here, and this one I will solder kind of like a little towards one side on this thing, like that. And then what I'll do is I'm going to cut a middle part out of here and narrow this down a little bit so we have a way to hook the pin through there. So let's do that next. One thing about these tubes, you don't usually want to pick them up while they're hot with the tweezers, because sometimes they'll squish them. So I'm going to cut a few little smaller pieces of solder. I don't need quite as big a chunks for this. You really, if you're doing this, you want to avoid having any solder flow to the inside of the tube. So if you like, a lot of people paint on solder, or flux I should say, and that's fine. That's one way to control where the solder flows. I'm just going to sweat a little bit onto this. Maybe a little more than that. Again, you don't want to put a lot of heat on that tube because it's so small compared to everything else here. And you don't want to get this so hot that you solder the bail on up there, so you need to kind of keep that in mind when you're directing your heat here. I think that's on there. Alright, and let's do a little flux on here, flux on the back of that. This one I think I'll just put the solder on the back of this thing. Make a puddle. That looks pretty good. Okay, so let's cool this off. Alright, so I'm going to do a little cleanup on this tube here now. So I'm going to take this in quite a bit further. I'm going to use the jeweler's saw, so I'm going to do this off camera to save time, but I'm just going to take it down a little bit narrower. So I did some cleanup with the Dremel. Let's see if I can get this guy through there. If you can't get your pin through the hinge, it usually means some solder has flowed inside of it, and that's going to cause problems probably. So we want to redo it if something like that happens. We don't want any of the solder flowing into this. hinge, because if it gets too far in, it'll seize up the whole hinge and we'll have to cut it off and start again. If you're interested in seeing more detailed hinge tutorial, check up there. I'll put a link up there for my 3 hinge pendant. In order to prevent any of that solder flowing into this joint, I want to make sure to get rid of any excess flux, because flux can be a way for solder to stick better to places we don't want it to. And so let's get rid of the excess. And then we'll come out and we'll solder that pin in, and then I will pickle it for real, and then clean it up, set the stone, or clean it up and polish it, and then I think I'll bring it back and set the stone after we polish this time, just because it's easier for you guys to see what's going on. So yeah, we'll be back in a minute. I'll let that pickle for a little while, get rid of a lot of the excess flux that's on there. And what I'm going to do now, this is doing a couple of things differently than I usually do for stuff. One, I'm going to paint on a little bit of flux right there and right there with a toothpick and just dry it with the torch. And then I'm going to use a little bit of easy solder, which I almost never do. But in this case, I really don't want any of this hard solder joints reflowing here. And that'll give me just a slight advantage in not having that happen, because you don't want any of that stuff flowing into the hinge joint. Okay, so like I said, I'm just going to dribble a little on the table there. Got a toothpick, and then heat this a bit. Pick up one of these little pieces of easy solder. And I don't have to heat the upper piece too much, because I don't really want anything to stick to the upper piece. I just want it to stick to the tube, which is attached to this down here, and the pin. Okay, let's see if it's still moving on us. Looks like it is. And honestly, if you get one side soldered on, that's probably good enough with these. You can just trim off the excess piece of wire there and then file it smooth. And it's not going to come out of there if one side at least is soldered. So, okay, so let's toss that in the pickle and let it clean up. It's pickle time. And then I'll do some pre-polishing. Polish it, and then I'll probably bring it back and set the stones after that. I have a really tight bezel on this one, and I was checking the size on it and stuff, and I pushed it in hard, and I don't think I'm going to be able to get it out of there, so I'm going to go ahead and set it. But as normal, I'm going to go around here with the side of my chain nose pliers. This is a pretty deep stone. There wasn't a lot of space to spare, so I normally put a little bit of tag board underneath it in order to give it some compressibility. I really didn't have much room to do that on this one. Do a little bit of burnishing. The other reason I polished this mostly first is because I'm going to have to use some epoxy to epoxy in this other piece, and I wanted that to be my last step really, and I wanted to get this finished. So so we'll go ahead and set this one next. Trick on these is to get them pinched in there enough so they don't rock anymore. And then you can just start rolling it over the stone. If you push too hard on one side when it's not seated in there, it'll tend to ride up on the other side. Oops. Well, it didn't pop out when I did that. That's a good sign. Normally I poke them from behind, but the hole is in a place where I can't really poke very well from. So if I throw it against the wall, that's usually a good test. We got some 5-minute epoxy here. Some tag board. And a toothpick. And then I got to figure out a way to position it so it doesn't sag or something while it's setting up. But I think that's going to be pretty. Okay, so let me get some acetone. Fingernail polish remover is handy as a solvent for super glue, or not super glue, I should say, epoxy. If you've never used epoxy, it comes in 2 parts. It's got the resin and the hardener, and you're supposed to mix them in equal parts. So these things have just 2. Oh, this is a strong smelling kind. I don't need much here, but you want to get relatively close to the same amount of each. The other thing is, for this stuff to really work, you need to mix it up really well. If you don't mix it up really well, it may not ever cure completely. So this is 5-minute epoxy, meaning it'll get relatively hard in 5 minutes to where you probably won't be able to move the piece. But I would mix it for at least a minute just to make sure you get that stuff all mixed together. So I got way more than I really need in here, but I'm going to scrape some into there. And just plop the back of that stone in there too to make sure we get some against the back. There's likely going to be a lot that oozes out of here when I do this. That's why I brought this stuff. I can wipe it off nicely and not leave any residue. That seems pretty good. Leave that sit for a few minutes. Let that cure. And then I'll kind of do a final little buff up and polish. A good way to know whether it's cured is to check this, and once this thing stops moving, it's getting pretty close. That's basically what our pendant's going to look like. I'll take some better pictures for the end, and I hope you enjoyed that. That was kind of a fun one to make. I always like how these ones that are kind of pendulous come out. And we should get good movement with this one because of the hinge and also the loose free-moving bail up here. So I think that'll be good. Well, thanks for watching my video. I appreciate it. Make sure to hit the like button before you leave. Check out some of my other videos too, and maybe subscribe. I'd love to have you as a subscriber. I'm putting out 2 to 3 videos per week, generally 3, and content for Patreon as well. So I'm pretty busy, but I'm putting out some good content, so check it out. If you want to, check out my website. There's a link to it right there. I have some of the stuff I make here as well as other things I've made for sale, so check it out. Finally, thanks for watching the video, and I hope you found it useful. Happy silversmithing. Take care.